All right. All right. All right. Welcome back to the live show. You know what time it is. It is currently 3:51 p.m. And of course, today's date is the 29th of June 2025. Yes, a lot is going on right now in the United States. First of all, I got to say, God is the greatest. The United States is the greatest nation on the face of the earth. God bless you guys for being here. Whether you're Republican or Democrat or independent, progressive, liberal, or conservative. Look, my brain is fried right now. Whether you're a Republican, Democrat, uh, independent, it doesn't matter. Okay. What you have to understand is you are a United States citizen and you love the United States. Okay. That's all that matters. That is all that matters. With that being said, we're going to check out this Senate hearing. All right. We're going to check out this Senate hearing right here. It is senators debating about war powers resolution requiring Congress approving military actions against Iran. All right, like I said, doesn't matter if you are a liberal or you're conservative or you are a progressive. It does not matter. All right, it does not matter. What matters is you love the United States. With that being said, I want you guys to enjoy the show. Be nice in the comment section, okay? Be nice. Please be nice. All right. Be nice in the comment section. And with that being said, enjoy the show.
Senator from Virginia.
Pursuant to Section 601B of the International Security Assistance and Arms Control Export Act, I move to discharge the Committee on Foreign Relations from further consideration of S.J. Res. 59 to direct the removal of United States Armed Forces from hostilities against the Islamic Republic of Iran that have not been authorized by Congress.
The clerk will report.
Senator from Virginia, Mr. Kaine, moves to discharge S.J. Res. 59 to direct the removal of United States Armed Forces from hostilities against the Islamic Republic of Iran that have not been authorized by Congress from the Committee on Foreign Relations.
Madam President, we will begin a couple of hours of debate on this resolution prior to a vote that I understand is scheduled around 6 or maybe a little bit thereafter. And I rise to talk about the resolution for the second time in the last week, and I needn't repeat all the points that I made when I spoke about it last week. But I'll just begin with this. I came to the Senate in January of 2013, and I tell people that I came with 100 interests and 10 passions and 1 obsession. And the obsession that I brought with me to this body was an obsession that I would do everything possible I could to stop the United States from getting into an unnecessary war. Why did I bring that obsession with me in 2013? I brought it with me because of the experience in Virginia during 2 wars over the course of 20 years, from 2001 to 2021. I was governor of Virginia from 2006 to 2010. I was lieutenant governor of Virginia before that. And like every state in this country, Virginia was deeply, deeply affected by the global war on terror. When I was governor of Virginia, I had the honor and responsibility, but it was also a burden, of being the commander-in-chief of the Virginia National Guard. And that meant that I was with our guardsmen and women when they deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, when they came home. I went to funerals, I went to wakes. These were very, very moving experiences. I visited, as governor, our troops, our guardsmen and women in both Iraq and Afghanistan during that period where the war was at a huge upsurge. Thousands of Virginia guardsmen and women were deployed during those 4 years. And of course, because of who Virginia is, it wasn't just our guardsmen and women, it was also our active duty, our DOD civilians, civilians from other parts of the federal family, reservists, military contractors, DOD civilians and their families. The cost of that 20 years of war on Virginia was very heavy. And I came with the obsession not only because of what I had seen in terms of the effect of these wars on my Commonwealth and my country, the deaths, the injuries, the long-standing mental health needs, the tremendous expenditure of public treasure, the lack of clear and positive results from that 20 years. But I also came with an obsession on this topic because of watching the way the war started, particularly the war in Iraq. The United States was basically, the public and this body was basically lied to about the extent of the Iraqi program of weapons of mass destruction. And then an administration forced a vote on the floor of this body right before a midterm election. The debate and vote occurred in October of 2022. I remember at the time I was lieutenant governor and I was paying attention to this, and I thought, what's the urgency about this debate in October of 22, right before a midterm election? You might remember the United States didn't even invade Iraq until March of 2023. There was no urgency. There was none. But it was determined to be politically expedient to force a debate before a midterm election to try to give one party an edge in those midterms. Yeah, there was a vote, but it was timed and structured for political rather than military reasons, and thousands of Americans, both soldiers and contractors, lost their lives as a result. And so I came to this body fully believing that, yes, I'm only one of 100, but I'm going to do everything I can to make sure the United States doesn't get into an unnecessary war, and that if the issue ever arises, Congress needs to fully debate any military mission before he sends our sons and daughters into war. Now, Madam President, I say this as a senator from, I'm going to argue this, and the President will challenge me on this, but I'm going to say Virginia is the most pro-military state in the United States. Our military bases, our veterans population, our reservists, our Guard, our military families, our DOD civilians. Our map is a map of American military history. Yorktown, Appomattox, the Wilderness, Fredericksburg, 9/11 attack on the Pentagon. Everything about Virginia is connected to our nation's military mission. I know the President would make the same claim about Florida's connection to our military, and this would be a virtuous competition as we would all talk about how pro-military our states are, but I believe this deeply about Virginia. My dad was an Army officer. One of my kids is a Marine officer. I mean, this is family. And I'm connected deeply as a member of the Armed Services Committee to all of our military community. And I'm not a pacifist. Every year I work on the Armed Services Committee to help write a defense bill and try to get it passed. I whip votes on the floor for military aid packages to allies. There's bad folks in the world. The United States needs to defend itself, and it needs to work with allies to help them defend themselves. But our troops, our sons and daughters, deserve to have wise civilian leadership that only make the decision to send them into war on the basis of careful consideration and a debate before the entire public. The other night when I spoke on the floor, I pointed out the history of the way the framers of our Constitution grappled with this question in 1787. And to just make it simple, they decided, contrary to the history of the world and the way virtually every other country did it, they decided that war was too big a decision for one person. I mean, they were making this decision at the time that George Washington was president. He was very respected and admired. He was a wartime general, deeply respected. But as much as they respected leaders like George Washington, they said, war's too big a decision. It's too big a decision for one person. And so they wrote a constitution that said the United States should not be at war without a vote of Congress. Defense against an attack or an imminent attack, yes, the president as commander-in-chief has the power to do that. But to go on offense against another nation or an entity like a terrorist group, and there were terrorist groups back in the days like the Barbary Coast Pirates. From the very beginning, we have confronted threats not just by nation states but by others, but the decision was it was too big a decision for any one person, and we should only go to war after a debate, not only in Congress, where we put our thumbprint on this is a national mission, we're risking our sons and daughters' lives for. We have a debate in front of the entire public so they can understand the stakes. War is too big for any one person. I think the events of this week have demonstrated that war is too big to be consigned to the decisions of any one person. Our current commander-in-chief, on his social media account a day or two after the attack in Iran, put up a music video with lyrics that were matched to a Beach Boys song, Barbara Ann, but the music video contained these lyrics: bomb, bomb, Iran, bomb, 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 Iran, went to a mosque, gonna throw some rocks, time to turn Iran into a parking lot. We shouldn't premise a decision to send our sons and daughters into war on the judgment of a single person. The president patted himself on the back and he compared the attack to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That was a most unusual comparison. I haven't put all the lyrics of the song up on my chart. One of the other lyrics was about sending the Ayatollah home in a box. I mean, is this some kind of a joke? Is this the way we treat war now? Like we run a victory lap and we overstate it and we turn it into a funny music video, or we use a Hiroshima and Nagasaki comparison as if that's like a good thing? War is too big to leave the decision to send our sons and daughters and risk their lives on the say-so of one person. We had some turmoil this week in the Senate. We were going to have a briefing on Tuesday that they had to, from the national security officials of the administration, they had to postpone it till Thursday because they were fighting with themselves and they were fighting with reporters about intelligence that had come out that the president wasn't happy about. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, he said that the Iranian nuclear program had been completely obliterated. All sources, Iranian sources, Israeli sources, the IAEA, the United States, have said severe damage. But because the president sort of went overboard with the Hiroshima and Nagasaki claims and completely obliterated, reporters started to dig into it. And then the president got mad, and then his Secretary of Defense started to name-call reporters who were asking basic questions. War is too big an issue to leave to the moods and the whims and the daily vibes of any one person. And that's why the founder said, unless it's an imminent defense, and in this case it wasn't, the Israeli foreign minister had said before the U.S. attack that their attacks had already set the Iranian program back at least 2 or 3 years. That's a direct quote from the Israelis who follow this very closely. If the program had been set back at least 2 or 3 years, what was the urgency that suggested we needed to take this action without a debate in Congress? And Madam President, it was not only done without congressional authorization, it was also done without congressional consultation, and it was done without congressional notification of Democratic leaders. Republican leaders were given a briefing, but for the first time during my time here, no Democrat in a leadership position on the key committees was given an advance notice of this. Is war now to be a partisan thing? Where the White House just notifies those of the same party? I've tried to be consistent about this, Madam President. When I came to the Senate in 2013 with this passion that I'm going to do anything I can to stop an unnecessary war, within a few months after arriving here, President Obama, who is a personal friend, was contemplating military action in Syria. And I looked my friend in the eye and I said, you do not have congressional authority to do that. You need to bring this to Congress. Hey, I thought you were my supporter. Thought you were my friend and you would support this. I do support you, and I think you have good judgment, and I think you're likely to make a careful decision, but war is too big an issue to leave in the hands of even a completely careful and deliberative individual. The framers didn't want to leave war in the hands of George Washington, for God's sake. They thought Congress should be involved in it. And I said to President Obama, you need to bring this to Congress. And guess what? A lot of members of this body said the same thing. 7 members in the Senate right now were in the House in 2013. And I have a letter that many of them wrote. 6 members who are currently Republican members of the Senate signed this. August 28, 2013, dear Mr. President, we strongly urge you to consult and receive authorization from Congress before ordering the use of U.S. military force in Syria. Your responsibility to do so is prescribed in the Constitution and the War Powers Resolution of 1973. We were in a recess then, it was August. But they said, if you deem that military action is necessary, Congress can reconvene at your request. We stand ready to come back into session, consider the facts before us, and share the burden of decisions regarding U.S. involvement in the quickly escalating Syrian conflict. 6 Republican members of this body signed that letter in 2013, but based on their public statements, they seem to have a different standard for President Trump than they did for President Obama, a different standard for war against Iran than they did for war against Syria. There's one member who signed this letter who is consistent. Congressman Peter Welch is now in the Senate. He signed this letter to a president of his own party saying, you can't do this without a vote of Congress. Come to Congress. And he is taking the same position on the floor today consistently that he did then. Madam President, I'm going to conclude and just say this. I know everybody in this body is praying that the ceasefire that is in place now for a couple of days works and that it holds. I know everybody is praying that when the administration now says they're interested in a diplomatic resolution to this program, that they will have learned that they shouldn't tear up diplomatic deals as they did in 2018, but instead should prefer diplomacy and step back from war against Iran. I pray that that holds and that we won't need to be back here doing this again, but I do note that the president, even today, said he would certainly bomb Iran again. I'm hoping, I'm realistic, but I'm hoping that members of this body will stand up for the Constitution, will stand up for the proposition that war is too big to be decided by one person, will stand up for the principles that they articulated pretty clearly when it came to President Obama thinking about taking war into Syria. At that moment, when we urged President Obama to do that, he didn't use military force. He did bring it to Congress. We had a debate in the Foreign Relations Committee. We passed an authorization, and in that debate, Syria stepped forward and said they would give up their chemical weapons program. Diplomacy achieved a result, just as diplomacy achieved a more effective control of the Iranian nuclear program, even than the bombs that we dropped last Saturday until it was torn up. I pray the ceasefire continues, but I fear we're going to be back here on this floor. And I hope when we are on this floor again, members of this body will stand for the proposition that has been part of our history, that war is too big an issue to allow one person to make the decision that sends our sons and daughters into harm's way. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today in support of Senator Kaine's War Powers Resolution to make crystal clear that, as required by the Constitution of the United States, the President may not take offensive military action against Iran or any other country without congressional approval. Last Saturday, the world learned through a social media post by Donald Trump that he had ordered an attack on 3 of Iran's nuclear enrichment sites, the first ever direct U.S. military assault on Iranian territory. We all agree that Iran must not obtain a nuclear weapon, but bombing is not the best, most sustainable way of achieving that goal, and nothing I heard yesterday at the intelligence briefing changes that assessment. The bombing attack was also a clear violation of the U.S. Constitution, which reserves to the Congress the power to declare war. And make no mistake, initiating a bombing attack against another country is not only a matter of foreign policy, it is an act of war. For anyone who claims otherwise, I ask them to consider this. What would we have said if Iran or any other country had flown bombers over our country and struck our facilities. We would rightly call it what it was, an act of war. While the president has the authority to defend the United States when attacked, Article 1 of the Constitution vests the responsibility to go to war explicitly and exclusively in the Congress, not in one person in the Oval Office. James Madison put it best in 1793 when he wrote, and I quote, "In no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislature and not to the executive. The trust and temptation would be too great for any one man," unquote. That's why the framers of the Constitution designed a system of checks and balances to stop the government from ignoring the will of the American people. And the American people absolutely do not want the United States to be dragged into more unnecessary wars. So, Madam President, beyond the debate over the particular politics or policy of President Trump's decision to attack Iran, this debate is about the rule of law. And no president, past, present, or future, is above the law. Those strikes violated American law, and prominent legal experts have said they also violated international law. The fact that there is now a ceasefire in place does not obviate the need to pass this resolution. President Trump has already shown that he is willing to initiate hostilities on his own. And indeed, as Senator Kaine just mentioned, President Trump just said a few hours ago that he would, quote, absolutely consider bombing Iran again. And just last month, when asked whether he needs to uphold the Constitution of the United States, President Trump answered, quote, "I don't know." We, the United States Senate and House, should make clear that compliance with our Constitution is not optional. Now, President Trump did not just attack another country in violation of the Constitution. He did so in spite of facts presented by our own U.S. intelligence agencies. Just 3 months ago, the U.S. intelligence community noted that, and I quote, "They continue to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Supreme Leader Kaine has not authorized the nuclear weapons program he suspended in 2003, unquote. That assessment has been reaffirmed year after year since at least 2007, that Iran was not producing a nuclear weapon and had not made a decision to do so. You would think that the facts and intelligence assessments would matter when a president chooses to attack another country. Apparently not in this case. Indeed, when President Trump was confronted with the U.S. intelligence community's assessment just days before he launched the attack, he dismissed it. It was an inconvenient fact. It was inconvenient because it showed there was more time for diplomacy to work, time to get a negotiated solution. Secretary Rubio was asked about this intelligence assessment after the United States bombed Iran. His answer, very revealing. He said, and I quote, "Forget about the intelligence," unquote, and then went on to try to justify the timing of the attack. Now, as I said earlier, most, if not all of us, agree that Iran must not have a nuclear weapon, which would pose an existential threat to Israel, threaten America's interests in the region by further emboldening Iran's malign actions, and increase the risk of nuclear proliferation throughout the Middle East. So the question is, how do we best accomplish that goal in a durable way that doesn't unleash unintended consequences and put Americans and others at greater risk? President Obama answered that question. That's exactly what he accomplished through the agreement his administration negotiated with Iran 10 years ago this July. President Obama made a deal with Iran to prevent it from building a nuclear weapon. And the agreement was working. Iran was subject to around-the-clock, 24-hour inspections from the International Atomic Energy Agency. That agreement made the whole world a safer place. But in his very first term, Donald Trump ripped up that deal. Not surprisingly, Iran began to enrich uranium at higher levels, though still not at the 90% level needed for bomb-grade material. Now, by the time Donald Trump returned to the White House this year, even he and his administration had come to understand that the best way to ensure that Iran does not decide to develop a nuclear weapon is through negotiation. That's why earlier this year, he dispatched his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, to open negotiations with Iran. And those negotiations were ongoing. Indeed, the sixth round of discussions were scheduled to take place on Sunday, June 15th, just 2 days before the Netanyahu government launched its attacks on Iran. Not surprisingly, that Israeli attack derailed the ongoing U.S.-Iran negotiations. It is important to remember that a decade earlier, Prime Minister Netanyahu worked very hard to derail President Obama's ongoing negotiations with Iran. Indeed, Prime Minister Netanyahu even addressed a joint session of Congress, urging the Congress not to proceed with those negotiations. Prime Minister Netanyahu did not succeed in derailing President Obama's JCPOA negotiations. That agreement went into effect, and it did make the world and our country and Israel a safer place. But unlike then, Prime Minister Netanyahu succeeded this time. He outmaneuvered Donald Trump. That story is well documented in a June 17th New York Times piece entitled, and I quote, "How Trump Shifted on Iran Under Pressure from Israel," unquote, and a June 23 Washington Post story entitled, and I quote, "Netanyahu decided on Iran war last year and then sought to recruit Trump," unquote. Simply put, Prime Minister Netanyahu accomplished that goal. President Trump joined his war of choice against Iran. And in doing so, President Trump put our men and women in uniform in the region in grave danger and unnecessary risk. Following the attack, Iran fired 14 missiles at a major U.S. airbase in Qatar. Fortunately, Iran gave the United States and Qatar advance warning, and there were no casualties. But the full extent of Iranian retaliation could play out throughout the region and other places around the world over a long period of time. And what was accomplished? What was accomplished? To hear President Trump tell it, the Iranian nuclear program was, quote, obliterated, unquote. That is flat out untrue. Untrue. We know from public reporting that a Defense Intelligence Agency assessment found that the strikes only set back Iran's nuclear program by a few months. Whether it's a few months or somewhat longer, the point is this: the strikes did not obliterate Iran's nuclear program. Before the attacks, U.S. intelligence assessed that Iran was not building a nuclear weapon, and in the aftermath of the attacks, Iran may well change its mind and move forward. So President Trump disregarded politically inconvenient U.S. intelligence assessment when he launched the attacks, and he's now making up his own politically convenient narrative about the results. What's been particularly cowardly is the Trump administration's efforts to escape their own failures by hiding behind the amazing men and women of the U.S. military. to hear President Trump and Secretary of Defense Heskes tell it, any criticism of their decision to attack Iran is somehow a criticism of the American military. This is garbage, and they know it. Our servicemen and women performed their mission flawlessly, and they did it with courage and with resolve. It's especially rich to see Donald Trump, who so often insulted and belittled our military heroes, now try to hide his own failings behind them. So let's be clear. While we owe our service members our debt of gratitude, we do not owe that debt of gratitude to President Trump or members of his cabinet for their decisions or for their current efforts to manipulate the narrative about the results of the attack. I have to say, as my colleague Senator Kaine mentioned, that the spectacle of President Trump and Secretary Hesketh berating the press for questioning their claims that the Iranian nuclear program had been, quote, obliterated only reveals their manic desperation to hide the truth. Remember when President George Bush declared with respect to Iraq, mission accomplished? What President Trump and Secretary Hesketh are communicating is that it's somehow treasonous to ask about intelligence reporting that casts doubts on their claims. This is not only an effort to intimidate and silence the press, it also sends a terrible message to all the intelligence analysts in the U.S. government. It says that anybody who presents facts that don't fit President Trump's political narrative is trying to, as Secretary Hesketh said, make the president look bad, or undermining the success of our pilots, or trying to manipulate the public mind. That's ridiculous. We've already seen, Madam President, the dangers of manipulating intelligence to fit the president's narrative rather than fidelity to the facts. The United States went to war in Iraq under false pretenses. Remember when the Bush administration told America that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction? Remember when Vice President Cheney warned in March 2003 that, quote, if there's a mushroom cloud in New York, you will know that Saddam Hussein is behind it, unquote. And of course, there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So false intelligence and false narratives that fan the flames of unnecessary wars cost us dearly. The Iraq War cost the lives of over 4,000 American soldiers, hundreds of billions of dollars of American taxpayer money. The war upended the region, killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians, strengthened Iran, and unleashed ISIS on the world. It was the worst U.S. foreign policy blunder in a generation. Madam President, the Trump administration has now created a culture of fear and retribution throughout the federal government. We've already seen patriotic federal employees be fired for telling the truth. Whistleblower just filed a complaint the other day. He'd been at the Justice Department. He said, I didn't sign up to lie. So the real challenge is this. The president has not obliterated the Iran nuclear program, but he is doing everything he can to obliterate the credibility of the U.S. intelligence community so he can invent his own reality without contradiction. That's why it's more important than ever that Congress stand up for the Constitution and insist that the president cannot initiate hostilities without approval from Congress. That's what this resolution asks. It asks, do you support the Constitution and the role it gives the Congress to declare war? Do you believe that the people's representatives should have a voice in whether American lives, and specifically the lives of our nation's armed forces, are put at grave risk? We owe it to our troops, we owe it to the American people to ensure that no president, not this president or any other, can unilaterally commit our nation to go to war. The Constitution does entrust that responsibility to us. Let's not abdicate it. Colleagues, I urge you to vote yes on the Kaine War Powers resolution, and I yield the floor.
Madam President,
Senator from California.
I rise today in support of Senator Kaine's resolution for the simple and compelling reason that it upholds our constitutional duty. Regardless of what people may think of the military's execution of its mission last weekend, and our service members performed with courage, with professionalism, with extraordinary precision, or their views of its effectiveness, and I hope and pray the mission was effective. Iran is a malevolent regime. It is the paramount sponsor of terrorism in the world, and it must never be allowed to obtain the bomb. Regardless of whether you support the president's decision to engage in preemptive strikes in the first place, regardless of whether or not you support the president generally or you do not, the Constitution charges the Congress, not the president, with the power to declare war. Now, there may be a fog of war and a murky uncertainty concerning the battle damage assessment, but there is no ambiguity here when it comes to the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 provides the Congress shall have the power to declare war, not the president, or the president if it's not convenient to the Congress, but the Congress. And this body, for far too long, has been allergic to the responsibility it has to govern the use of military force. Not since the very early part of this century has Congress approved any authorization for the use of military force. Nevertheless, a great deal of military force has been, in fact, used by the United States since then in far-flung places in the world. In fact, post-World War II, the war power has been utilized by an increasingly strong executive and an increasingly deferential and fearful legislature. Now, during the last several weeks, it has been apparent to anyone watching that the conflict in the Middle East had the potential to draw in the United States of America. When missiles began striking Tehran and Tel Aviv, when the President of the United States, with signature bombast, began to telegraph the possibility that we would enter the fray, when countless American families were forced to consider whether their children would be the next to bear the burden and carry the sacrifices of another potentially endless war in the Middle East. And so, with those families and our service members in mind, Senator Kaine introduced this resolution to ensure that the president did not risk committing the United States to yet another open-ended conflict in the region without a debate in Congress and a decision by Congress as to whether the country should go down that dangerous road. Now, at that time, many senators, myself included, pushed for an intelligence briefing from the administration. We had significant questions we needed answered. Had Iran made the decision to build a bomb? Had Iran begun the process of building the mechanism of a bomb? Was there an imminent threat to the United States or our forces? What were the threats to U.S. personnel and facilities in the region should Iran respond? How might Iran and its proxies escalate and harm U.S. interests, not only in the region, but here at home and other parts of the world? How much damage could U.S. military action do to the Iranian nuclear and missile programs, and for how long would it set them back? And most important, what was the risk that such a bombing campaign could escalate into all-out war? Days passed, no briefings. Even after last Saturday's strikes, still no briefing. Not until yesterday did the administration come to Congress to answer the most basic of questions. And only after suggesting, it was reported, that they would potentially choke off further information to the Congress. The Constitution demands otherwise. The founders split the government's wartime powers just as they divided responsibilities for so many other things. It is Congress which declares war, which raises an army and a navy, and pays for the financial costs of defense and war. And keep in mind, the need for congressional approval of war-making was not hypothetical to the founders. The United States had just fought a war against a king, and the founders did not want to put the power to start another war in the hands of any single person. The framers put their thinking on parchment. And in a letter to Thomas Jefferson in the summer of 1789, James Madison reflected on how they had approached this question of war power, which was the subject of much debate in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention. He said, "We have already given in one example an effectual check on the dog of war by transferring the power of letting him loose from the executive to the legislative body, from those who are to spend to those who are to pay, from those who are to spend to those who are to pay." That is, because a decision as consequential as entering into war requires informed debate and buy-in from the people's representative and the public, from us here in the Senate and from our colleagues in the House, because we need to weigh the benefits and the risks for our constituents and for the country as a whole, because a decision like this one should be insulated from partisan politics and not made with haste or with blinders on. There are perhaps senators in this body who will say this debate is no longer needed. The mission is over. Iran has backed down. A lasting ceasefire is in place. The threat has passed. And I would say to them, I don't know that to be true, and neither do you. And on behalf of all those who could and would pay, we should not allow this great and solemn power to make war to be usurped any longer. The only way for us to know whether the United States might be drawn into a broader conflict is if we exercise our authority to prevent it, or to determine that the Congress wants to affirmatively provide a president with the authorization to use force. So I'm a yes on this resolution. And if the Senate votes to bring this resolution before the body, which I hope it will see the wisdom of doing, I will move an amendment that I have filed with Senators Kim and Kaine that I would hope would receive all of our support. Our amendment makes clear what is implicit in Senator Kaine's resolution already, and that is that terminating the use of U.S. armed forces against Iran does not affect the ability of the United States to defend itself, to share intelligence with Israel or our other partner nations, or to assist them in taking defensive measures to protect themselves from an attack by Iran or its proxies. Our intent in this amendment is to make it crystal clear that calling up and passing this resolution would in no way restrict the United States' ability to defend itself or our partners. And with that question settled, we should be able to turn to the real need for this debate. Should this Congress continue to abdicate our constitutional duty to an administration that at every turn has deemed us irrelevant? An administration that for too long deferred its obligation to brief Congress and has reportedly threatened to take steps to choke off the amount of information we have and need to assess the impact and the consequences of unilateral military action. An administration that openly disdains and threatens a free press, ignoring the fact that our fourth estate exists to ask questions for the people, even if those questions are uncomfortable, especially when those questions are uncomfortable, and shine a light on the places where tyranny and despotism can grow and foster and fester. Because here's the bottom line. Article 1, Section 8 says, the Congress shall have the power to declare war. And every American should know that Congress is not giving up on its most basic constitutional right to debate and determine whether U.S. forces undertake further operations, offensive operations, against the Iranian regime or any other. This resolution, with my amendment, would give senators confidence that a vote on that question will in no way put American troops or our allies at increased risk, and the underlying resolution would give the American people the confidence of knowing that they will not be dragged into another war without their consent. There must be a check on the dogs of war. There must be a voice for those who will pay the costs of going to war. And the Senate must be that voice. I yield back.
President,
Senator from Oregon.
I greatly appreciate the comments from my colleague from California, and particularly appreciate that my colleague from Virginia, Senator Kaine, has proposed this War Powers Resolution, a resolution that reaffirms a basic principle: that decisions of war and peace belong, under our Constitution, to Congress, not to the President. But on June 21st, President Trump ordered strikes on 3 Iranian nuclear facilities. There was no congressional authorization. There was no debate in this chamber. There was no vote in this chamber. The President made a unilateral decision that risked bringing the United States into another extended war in the Middle East. That is not how our founders designed our nation through the architecture of the Constitution. In fact, each member here swore an oath to uphold that Constitution that places the responsibility for declaring war upon this body, not upon the individual who sits in the Oval Office. To be sure, the President as Commander-in-Chief has the responsibility to protect the nation from an imminent threat. But in this case, there was not an imminent threat. First, according to our own intelligence, Iran was not pursuing a nuclear weapon. Second, even though Iran possessed significant amount of 60% enriched uranium, more than the 3 to 5% that is utilized for civilian energy, it was still not enriched to the level to build a bomb. And it would have had to only be enriched to 90%. It would have had been converted into metallic form. It would then have to have been arranged with an extensive system of explosives that compress it in order to start a chain reaction. That is a very difficult engineering feat. Third, prior to the U.S. strikes, Israel's foreign minister said Israel's attacks had already set back Iran's nuclear weapon program for at least 2 to 3 years. So let's be clear. The threat was not imminent. It was not a situation where there was no time for the President to observe the Constitution, to honor the Constitution, to seek an authorization for the use of military force from the Congress of the United States. The administration instead acted precipitously, putting American lives at risk, including the over 40,000 U.S. troops in the region, as well as diplomats and American civilians stationed or visiting the Middle East. Wars are easy to start, but they are often hard to end, and the consequences can be enormous. Look, for example, at the cost of the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq. More than 7,000 deaths of American men and women serving in uniform. More than 50,000 serious injuries, often life-altering injuries to America's sons and daughters serving in uniform. More than $8 trillion of American treasure spent. That is why the founders said the consequences of conflict, of entering into war, are so significant They must never be entrusted to a single person, not even the person who sits in the Oval Office. That's why they wrote the Constitution, placing the responsibility for that here, where it can be wrestled with, where it can be debated, where different perspectives can be brought to bear, where experts can be interviewed, and all can be taken into account in making such an important decision for our nation. From where we are right now, two things need to happen. First, Congress needs to reassert its constitutional authority over matters of war and peace. Second, we need to double down on diplomacy to secure a lasting peace. And a lasting peace includes at least three elements. Iran does not develop a nuclear weapon. Second, Iran stops funding militias across the region. And third, Iran's economy is freed up to prosper. Those are the three elements that need to be addressed. Let me begin first by addressing in some greater detail Congress's need to reassert its constitutional authority. On Meet the Press on Sunday, Senator Lindsey Graham said, quote, "You can't have 535 commander-in-chiefs." He is exactly right. And that is why the founders designed the Constitution with a separation of powers. Congress has the responsibility to decide if we go to war, and then the President commands our military to go to war. Article 1 gives Congress the power to declare war, and Article 2 gives the President the power to be the commander-in-chief to execute the war. Senator Kaine's War Powers Resolution says that hostilities with Iran must be explicitly authorized by Congress. But that does not in any way prevent the U.S. from defending itself from an imminent attack, should that need arise. This is a privileged resolution, meaning that we will have the opportunity to wrestle with it, and we will be voting on whether to do so later today. This resolution is urgently needed. We are already in the throes of a slide into an authoritarian state. Our president has been ignoring the Constitution or violating the Constitution by violating the rule of law that applies to the executive branch, by ignoring or suppressing or circumventing due process, the very issue that protects all of us from an overbearing executive. In fact, it is the defender of our freedom. Third, stiff-arming the courts. And fourth, seizing Congress's power of the purse. And then this week, it was reported that Trump will limit intelligence sharing with Congress. Another brazen attempt to centralize powers in the executive in a strongman presidency. With this resolution, Senator Kaine's resolution, Congress can reassert its constitutional authority as a co-equal branch of government, can stop this president from seizing even more dangerously unaccountable power. In addition to Congress taking this act, there is an urgent need for diplomacy in order to secure a lasting peace in the Middle East. That lasting peace includes the three elements that I mentioned: that Iran does not have a path to developing a nuclear weapon, that it stops funding militias across the region, and that Iran's economy is freed up to prosper. They can re-enter international commerce. It's already clear that diplomacy is not just essential, but that it is effective. In 2015, the United States helped negotiate the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, better known as the Iran nuclear deal, which blocked all paths for Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. It blocked the plutonium path. It blocked the uranium path. It blocked the covert path. That deal was so important for global security that it involved the United States, Russia, China, the United Kingdom, and France, all working together to create that framework in partnership with Iran. And Iran accepted massive inspections and oversight from the International Atomic Energy Agency to make sure that you not only had an act of trust, but lots of acts of verification. The deal worked. Iran was not developing a nuclear weapon. Instead, they dismantled their plutonium-based Iraq heavy water reactor. They agreed not to enrich uranium beyond 3.67%, and they didn't do so. They shipped all of their more highly enriched uranium out of the country, some 25,000 pounds, to be stored abroad. But 3 years later, President Trump tore up that agreement. He did so over the objections of his own national security officials, over the objection of his Secretary of Defense, General Jim Mattis, over the objection of his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, over the objection of his National Security Advisor, General McMaster, and over the objection of his Chief of Staff, General John Kelly. Had President Trump and his first administration not torn up that agreement, we'd be celebrating Iran's 10th anniversary under the nuclear deal with no path to a nuclear weapon. By ripping up the Iran nuclear deal, Trump opened the pathway for Iran to enrich beyond 3.67%, leading to the concerns that prompted Israel to attack Iran's nuclear facilities and that led Prime Minister Netanyahu to ask President Trump to use our planes and our abilities to bomb Isfahan, Natanz, and Fordow. To create an enduring agreement now that stops Iran from having a path to a nuclear weapon, restrictions like those that were in the Iran nuclear deal back in 2015 have to be recreated. And in fact, we've learned over the last few days how diplomats from President Trump's team have been working on this. We're in conversations with Iran before Israel's attack to create such an arrangement. And in fact, continued some of those conversations even as bombs were dropping. We have to succeed to put in place a permanent, detailed, enforceable plan for peace, which Iran agrees to, that stops funding for militias outside Iran and blocks all those paths to a nuclear weapon. Colleagues, we wouldn't be here today discussing this if President Trump hadn't torn up the first agreement that was working against the advice of his entire foreign affairs and security staff. That's what happens when you scoff at diplomacy, diplomacy that works, agreements that work, and unleash events in the world that lead to circumstances that realize themselves this year in 2025. The decision to strike Iran without authorization from Congress was wrong because there wasn't the imminent threat, and thus there was time to go through the process of seeking authorization for the use of military force necessitated by our Constitution. Wars are easy to start, but they are hard to end. And that's why the founders wanted us to debate them before the American people. We must reassert Congress's congressional authority. We must double down on diplomacy to secure long-term peace. We cannot allow our service members in uniform to be sent to war if we are not even willing to debate and vote on that war. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President,
Senator from Vermont.
I do not want the United States of America to be involved in yet another regime change war in Iran. Have we not learned anything from what happened in Iraq? We deposed Saddam Hussein and all hell broke loose. That was a war of regime change. No sense, since it wasn't related to 9/11. We had a regime change war in Afghanistan and then went on to embrace nation building. Thousands of Americans, men and women, who answered the call of the president, reported for duty, lost their lives, lost their limbs, are suffering today with PTSD. Trillions of taxpayer dollars have been spent and wasted. And yet in the Middle East, the flashpoint now is Iran. And we came within an eyelash of getting dragged into yet another war where the goal was regime change. Mr. President, I want to acknowledge the professionalism of our Air Force and our men and women in the military. The strike they were ordered to perform, they executed flawlessly. To them, I extend my congratulations. But the question for us is who authorizes the use of force? Our men and women will do what it is the commander-in-chief requires and do what it is Congress authorizes. We all have confidence in that. But this was a wake-up call for us because we came within an eyelash of being in a conflict where the goal would have been the Netanyahu goal of regime change. And what we did in this action with the president's decision to send our bombers in at the request of Netanyahu was essentially put in the hands of the Iranian government the question of how far this war would go. Would they turn the other cheek, which is essentially what they did? Or would they retaliate in a way, as President Trump said, that he would rain hellfire on them and have us in a war? The point here of the Kaine resolution is that if this country is going to make that decision, it must be Congress that authorizes that decision. It must be Congress that has the debate about what are the national security concerns, what are the costs, and what are the benefits. We can't simply bypass that and continue to abdicate our responsibility and congressional authority and duty. And that's why this resolution is so important. Now, this question of how do we get here? You know, wars oftentimes happen not by design. You stumble into it. And that is what almost happened here. We do not want a nuclear Iran. There's nobody in this United States Senate that wants a nuclear Iran. Russia doesn't want a nuclear Iran. China doesn't want a nuclear Iran. And our presidents, bipartisan, have worked hard to make certain that Iran didn't have it. And the Obama agreement was working. After President Trump was not President Trump, he challenged the agreement. When he got elected, he tore it up. But he saw at some point the wisdom of diplomacy. And he was engaged in active negotiations about a non-nuclear Iran and was making progress on those. That was objected to by Prime Minister Netanyahu. He was against the JCPOA that Obama was negotiating, and actually, as a foreign leader, came to this United States Congress and gave a speech in conflict with the commander-in-chief of the United States, where he lobbied in this Capitol against entering into an agreement that ultimately made us more secure. That determination on his part continues. And the biggest act of sabotage to the Trump negotiations on a nuclear agreement was the bombing campaign that Netanyahu did that sabotaged those talks. Now, again, I say congratulations to our men and women in uniform who, when they were ordered by the president to do the strike on the nuclear facilities, did it and did it well. But we should not at all discount how precarious that situation was for our country. It was a result of a decision by Iran to turn the other cheek, to disregard the attacks, and basically not escalate. And I'm so glad they did. And the president showed temperance there himself. But we can't be putting ourselves in a position where our future, and whether we do get in a war, is based on actions of other people, particularly folks who run Iran. So if we are going to protect the national security, if we are going to protect the men and women of this country who will always respond to the call of the commander-in-chief, that's what makes them such wonderful patriots. They cede the authority to make a decision about whether they are put in harm's way to the men and women who serve in the Congress of the United States and the commander-in-chief. That's a profound responsibility that each of us has to debate the question of whether we should commit this country to war. So this resolution is absolutely vital. Vital to the well-being of this country, to the humility that is required of a country before it makes the ultimate decision to ask the men and women who are citizens of our country to potentially sacrifice their lives for the well-being of this country. Mr. President, I urge my colleagues to support the Kaine resolution. I yield back.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky.
The Constitution is clear. Congress, not the President, has the authority to declare war. The founders were unanimous in proclaiming that the power to declare war belonged exclusively to Congress. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, said that the executive branch was the branch most prone to war. Therefore, the Constitution, with studied care, vested that power in the legislature. Madison would further state that in no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war and peace to the legislature and not to the executive branch. Hamilton, who didn't always agree with Madison or Jefferson, wrote that the legislature can alone declare war, can alone transfer the nation from a state of peace to a state of war, and if the legislature has a right to make war on one hand, it is on the other hand the duty of the executive to preserve peace till war is declared. Madison and Hamilton had very different visions of executive power, yet they both agreed that it was vitally important to entrust the power to declare war to Congress, not the executive branch. George Washington remarked that the Constitution vests the power of declaring war with Congress. Therefore, no offensive expedition of importance can be undertaken until after they shall have deliberated upon the subject and authorized such a measure. No offensive expedition without congressional approval. St. George Tucker, a Revolutionary War era law professor, wrote in 1803 of how our Constitution diverged from the English tradition. He wrote, "In England, the right of making war is in the king. With us, the representatives of the people have the right to decide this important question. It is without question that Congress neither deliberated nor authorized the recent offensive military action against Iran. Each of us has taken an oath to uphold the Constitution. Deferring the decision as to when, where, and why the country goes to the war to any president is a dereliction of duty on the part of Congress. To commit America's military to fight wars on behalf of the nation is the most consequential and humbling responsibility that Congress is entrusted with. If we are to ask our young men and women to fight and potentially give their lives, then we in this body can at least muster the courage to debate if American military intervention is warranted. Washington's record of involvement in the greater Middle East is particularly abysmal, with dozens of campaigns costing thousands of American lives and trillions of dollars. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Pakistan, Yemen, Sudan, Somalia, and now Iran, all countries in the region that the U.S. has bombed or is bombing. In each case, the hawks in Washington were adamant that the U.S. military intervention would lead to a glorious future and a great peace. Instead, after tragically losing thousands of lives and trillions of dollars, the U.S. is not in a better strategic position thanks to our interventions. After September 11th, a generation of brave Americans answered the call to serve, many enduring multiple deployments in the region. Some 7,000 U.S. service members paid the ultimate sacrifice in the war on terror. Tens of thousands more carry with them the scars of war, living with missing limbs, shrapnel, nerve damage, brain injuries, burns, scars. Some live with paralysis and are confined to wheelchairs. The mental wounds of war are also present, as we remember the more than 30,000 veterans who have committed suicide since Washington's misguided project to remake the Middle East. While our soldiers carry out their missions with honor, the Washington establishment consistently fails them. In almost all cases, our interventions were counterproductive, making us less safe and less prosperous. As the initial jubilation wears off from those who clamor for war, the regional situation remains precarious, and American service members remain in danger. Many advocates for war, giving voice to their real feelings, have loudly opposed the current ceasefire. Those arguing against a ceasefire give a callous testimony, insensitive to the cruelties of war. Some 40,000 U.S. troops are scattered throughout the Middle East as we speak, some on large established bases, others on isolated outposts. It is impossible to ensure all these locations have adequate air and missile defense capabilities. Our troop presence in the region is therefore a significant liability, allowing Iran and its proxies an opportunity to target Americans, which they otherwise would not have. Yet the Washington foreign policy establishment seems content to allow our service members to serve as sitting ducks. Should American soldiers get wounded or, God forbid, killed in a retaliatory strike, the calls for war emanating from Washington will surely be deafening. History is replete with examples of leaders who, in their hubris, thought they could shape the fate of nations, but were subsequently proven wrong as events ended up controlling them. Our own country sadly experienced this during Vietnam. The needless tragedy of that war, in which 58,000 Americans paid the ultimate sacrifice, led Congress to pass the War Powers Resolution we debate today. Congress intended to ensure a president would never again unilaterally plunge the American people into war without the people's representatives in Congress debating the issue. We owe to all Americans who have worn the uniform to honor that humbling responsibility. Moreover, despite the tactical success of our strikes, they may end up proving to be a strategic failure. It is unclear if this intervention will fully curtail Iran's nuclear aspirations, or, in fact, whether the Iranians may well conclude to double down on their efforts to obtain a nuclear weapon. At this time, it is unknown. The lesson Tehran and other unsavory regimes around the world may learn is that the only way to deter a strike is to maintain a nuclear deterrent. Pandora's box has been opened, and the consequences remain to be seen. Congress must now focus its efforts on de-escalation and preventing the call for regime change, the consequences of which, if applied to Iran, risk the total destabilization of the Middle East. The American people are sick and tired of sending their children to fight and die in war zones on the other side of the world with no tangible U.S. interest at stake. Abdicating our constitutional responsibility by allowing the executive branch to unilaterally introduce U.S. troops into wars is an affront to the Constitution and to the American people. Today's vote offers every member of this body an opportunity to stand up for the Constitution, to stand up for American service members, and to stand up for America's strategic interests. I will vote in support of this resolution and urge my colleagues to do so as well.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
We have a quorum call.
We are not.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, in a 1793 letter to William Cabell Reeves, James Madison said this. He said, "In no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislature and not to the executive department." A few years later, in another letter, this time to Thomas Jefferson as part of their famous correspondence, Madison expounded on that very simple superlative, naming the War Powers Clause in the Constitution as the most important. He said, "The Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It has accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war in the legislature." Our founding fathers didn't get everything right. They didn't see ahead of time that this chamber would be divided in two, Republicans on one side, Democrats on the other side, but they knew, having watched the course of human history, that executives, in their day, mostly all monarchs and kings, had all sorts of reason to drag their nation into war. Power often came from war. The funding that could be raised for war, the loyalty commanded by war, the glory that occasionally came to the leader, the ruler, through war and through conquest. There was great risk in war, but there was also great reward in war. And there was far too much of it in the era in which our Constitution was being formed. The purpose of the founders was to give the American people a voice in government, a revolutionary idea at the time, but it was also to order our government in a way that war would become less likely, would become less frequent. They imagined a world, this new America, in which peace would be the rule, not war, as it was at the time for the citizens of Europe who lived under the rule of kings, prone to war, incentivized to war, as James Madison wrote to Thomas Jefferson. And so this part of the Constitution, with more wisdom in it than any other part of the Constitution, according to James Madison, is this section of our founding document that says it is not up to the ruler, it is not up to the executive branch, it is up to the branch of government most connected to the people to decide whether we go to war, to require that there be a debate, a conversation that involves everyone in this nation, that requires, that necessitates a collective decision as to whether to put the brave soldiers of this country and the collective security of the nation at risk. And so we are here today because we still find wisdom in that clause of the Constitution. We still see great risk in moving into a world which we are quickly moving to, in which that clause that James Madison named as the supreme clause of the Constitution is dead letter, And that is the risk. Because there are very few wars that are so planned, so far in advance, that there is time to come and have a month-long debate. Wars happen quickly, and they necessitate quick action, according to the Constitution. Yes, we have always accepted that there has to be an exception, but a limited exception to that supreme clause in the Constitution. If there is an imminent attack against the United States, of course, the people of the United States want the ability of the President of the United States to respond to that imminent attack. But in the absence of an imminent attack, there is no exception. There is no ability to go around Congress. And in the case of the hostilities against Iran that the president began last weekend, there was no imminent threat against the United States. There was no army marching on this nation. There was no nuclear bomb that even existed that could be dropped on the United States or our soldiers in the region. And so it was required, it is required under the Constitution that the president come to Congress. If the president doesn't need to come to Congress to attack another nation preemptively, preventatively, absent an imminent threat, then that provision of the Constitution is dead letter, period, stop. And the most important piece of this document, according to our most revered founding father, is no longer operational. And if we lurch into a world in which any executive can send us to war without the participation of the American people, then we are in a world that our founding fathers could never have imagined. So I'm very glad to be on the floor today as a big fan of the wisdom of our founders to support Senator Kaine's resolution. And I appreciate his consistency in bringing this question before us. I don't want to live in a world in which the greatest question that this country could envision, whether or not we send our brave men and women to fight on our behalf, is not a question that doesn't involve the collective conversation of this body and of the people of this nation. So I think it's an important resolution to debate here, and I hope my colleagues will support it. It doesn't really have to do with whether you think there is wisdom in this action or not, whether you think the president was right or wrong. This is an opportunity for us to stand up for our responsibility under the Constitution to be a co-equal branch in setting foreign policy. I have my thoughts on the wisdom of this action. I've stated that I think it's very dangerous when the President of the United States deliberately misleads the country about the efficacy of our military operations overseas or the threats presented to this country. It's unforgivable anytime a president doesn't tell the truth, but it is especially unforgivable when the president doesn't tell the truth about national security intelligence. I know my colleagues here come to different conclusions, but if the reporting is correct that Iran, even after these strikes, still has centrifuges and still has enriched uranium and still has scientists who know how to put those things together, then it just is not true that the program has been obliterated. That is a program that can be reconstituted in a relatively short amount of time because, of course, knowledge is not able to be destroyed by bombs. The only way that you are going to make this country and this world safe from Iran's nuclear weapons ambitions, and they have them, is diplomacy. I hope that diplomacy got easier because of these strikes, but I don't think they did. I don't think diplomacy got closer because of these strikes and whatever follow-on strikes may come as President Trump is currently threatening. And so if diplomacy is the only path, if you can't bomb out of existence knowledge, then I don't think this was a very good week for American national security. But I come to a different conclusion than many of my Republican colleagues do, even some of my Democratic colleagues. But Senator Kaine's resolution is so important because that's the debate that we should be having. That's the argument that we should be having in public. That debate over the wisdom of dropping bombs in a far-off land that could put our troops at risk, that could drag us into a war, that's not a debate that the Founding Fathers thought that should take place behind closed doors at the Department of Defense, at the CIA, in the White House. That's actually the debate that they thought that this body should have, the United States Senate, that the House of Representatives should have. And that's the chance that we have today to bring that debate out of the shadows, out of the secret, to the place where the Founding Fathers thought it should exist. And that's why I urge my colleagues to support Senator Kaine's resolution. Yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. President. President Trump's actions to address Iran's nuclear weapons program last weekend didn't start a war. They ended a war. And so I rise today to support President Trump's wisdom and leadership in decisively countering Iran's nuclear threat, and therefore to oppose this ill-conceived joint resolution. As United States Senator and former ambassador to Japan, I understand and respect the role that Congress plays in matters of war and peace. But I cannot, and I will not, support a resolution that removes the ability of the President of the United States to act decisively in defense of national interests, our allies, and our armed forces. This resolution, if passed, would send a dangerous message, not just to Iran's terrorist-sponsoring regime, but also to every adversary who's seeking to exploit our domestic debates and internal divisions. This resolution would signal that America's resolve can be hamstrung by congressional hesitation at the very moment when clarity, unity, and strength are most needed. I cannot state this strongly enough. President Trump acted entirely within his constitutional authority under Article 2 and in accordance with his solemn duty to defend this nation and to defend the American people. Operation Midnight Hammer was a targeted, strategic, and necessary use of force to eliminate immediate threats posed by the Iranian regime and its proxies. No American lives were lost or injured during this military operation, thanks to the leadership of President Trump, the advice and counsel of Vice President J.D. Vance, National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, and General Dan Kaine, and the brilliant planning and flawless execution of the men and women of the United States Armed Forces. For decades, the Iranian regime has been attacking U.S. personnel, our allies, and our interest. Through its Revolutionary Guard, through Hezbollah and Hamas and Houthi terrorists, and through its missile programs and multiple cyber attacks. For decades, the Iranian regime has cynically violated international agreements to overtly and covertly pursue the capabilities necessary to make nuclear weapons on short notice. The idea that the president, in the face of escalating threats, can only sit idly by until Congress can hold hearings and schedule votes is not just naive, it's reckless. This war powers resolution ignores the reality of modern warfare, and it would constrain the commander-in-chief at the precise moment when decisiveness is most critical. It elevates process over common sense policy and political optics over operational necessity. If the president had been forced to act in accordance with this resolution last week, the element of surprise would have been entirely lost, and the successful mission flown by our brave airmen would have been much different and likely much costlier. Of course, Congress must be consulted. Of course, we can debate the scope and strategy of our military engagements, but we must not shackle our president in the middle of a crisis when lives are on the line. We must not embolden the Ayatollahs in Tehran by showing division and delay, because that is the path to endless wars rather than the path to decisive victories. President Trump acted wisely and proportionately to protect American lives. He acted to reestablish the credibility of our strategic deterrence. And he acted after decades of Iranian aggression that went largely unanswered by the previous administrations of President Joe Biden and Barack Obama. President Trump once again demonstrated decisive leadership in the service of peace and stability. That is the actual job of the commander-in-chief. Let me conclude by repeating what I said at the start. President Trump's actions last weekend did not start a war. His actions ended a war, and not a single American life was lost. We should not be here debating how to constrain effective presidential leadership, but rather discussing how to recognize effective leadership and supporting it. For this reason, I urge my colleagues to oppose Senate Joint Resolution 59. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, thank you. The most significant responsibility and heavy burden the President has is the determination of when to engage the armed forces of our nation. Such decisions can both cost and save lives. This past Saturday, President Trump directed our military to respond to a growing threat that Iran could weaponize nuclear material and deliver a nuclear weapon. With escalating tensions between our ally Israel and our adversary Iran, the President made the decision to deter and delay the capabilities Iran has to deliver a nuclear weapon. What we know to date is from our intelligence sources that the President's actions were significant and successful. The United States Constitution splits the responsibility of the use of military force between legislative and executive branches. Having received a classified and thorough briefing from our military, intelligence, and diplomatic officials, I conclude that the President acted within his constitutional authorities. I welcome the return to a stricter constitutional balance of power between the branches of government. Under the circumstances of the recent actions of the President and the timing of the offering of the resolution now before the Senate, we should not adopt the resolution, which states in part, Congress hereby directs the President to terminate the use of United States armed forces for hostilities against the Islamic Republic of Iran, unless explicitly authorized by a declaration of war. With the continuing threat from Iran against Israel, the dangers to American military men and women in the region, and because of the potential for terrorist acts upon U.S. interests within and without our borders, I believe the President has the constitutional authority and responsibility to defend the United States and its interests against imminent threats. I appreciate the President's decisive action and express gratitude and respect for the men and women of the military who carried out his orders, and I support the President in his efforts to find a peaceful resolution to hostilities in the region. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the following senators be permitted to speak prior to the scheduled vote. Senator Sanders for up to 10 minutes, Senator Graham for up to 10 minutes, Senator Risch for up to 10 minutes, Senator Kaine for up to 3 minutes, Senator Schumer for up to 3 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont.
Thank you. Mr. President, everyone knows that our country faces enormous crises. We have a healthcare system that is broken and it is widely expensive. We have a housing crisis in which millions of people are spending far more than they can afford to put a roof over their heads. We have the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth, and a child care system which is dysfunctional. Millions of our kids cannot afford to go to college or are leaving school deeply in debt, and over 20% of our seniors are trying to get by on $15,000 a year or less. And oh, by the way, we have an existential threat in climate change, which might very well make the planet uninhabitable for future generations. These are just a few of the crises that Congress and the President should be addressing. Mr. President, in the midst of all of that, going to war against Iran and supporting Israel's unprovoked attacks against that country is not something that we should be doing. We do not need another unnecessary and costly war. We have had enough of them. Mr. President, in 1964, Congress voted with little debate for a Gulf of Tonkin resolution giving President Johnson the authority to escalate American military involvement in Vietnam. As a result, the U.S. expanded its presence in that country, and we were dragged fully into Vietnam's civil war. Eventually, some 2.7 million Americans served in Vietnam, and more than 58,000 died, and over 300,000 were wounded. The Vietnam War devastated an entire generation. It killed millions of Vietnamese, and it destabilized the region. It cost U.S. taxpayers hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. Mr. President, the Vietnam War was based on a series of lies. Years later, the U.S. government concluded that the supposed attacks that prompted the Gulf of Tonkin resolution did not happen as reported. The so-called domino theory, the ideological foundation of that war, was bogus. That was a war that never should have been fought. Mr. President, in 2002, as a member of Congress, a new member of Congress, I can recall vividly how politicians and the media relentlessly beat the drum about the need to go to war against Iraq and its leader, Saddam Hussein. Over and over again, we were told that Iraq was building weapons of mass destruction and that if we did not act quickly, nuclear weapons would be falling on America. Among those pushing for war in Iraq in 2002 were none other than Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who testified to Congress that, and I quote, "There is no question whatsoever that Saddam is seeking nuclear weapons. If you take out Saddam's regime, I guarantee you that it will have enormous positive reverberations," end quote. That was Netanyahu in 2002. The United States Congress, against my vote, invaded Iraq and became involved in a brutal sectarian war that lasted for almost a decade. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found. That war was based on a lie that cost us 4,500 brave young Americans, 32,000 wounded, and $3 trillion in taxpayer dollars. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis also died. Mr. President, war often has awful and unintended consequences. It should only be considered as a last resort. We should not go to war against Iran. First, let me state the obvious. Trump's attack against Iran is unconstitutional. Congress alone has the authority to take this country into war, not the president. Trump does not have that authority. Second, Iran did not pose an imminent military threat to the United States that would justify a preemptive attack. Just a few months ago, Trump's own Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, testified to Congress that the American intelligence community, quote, continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon and Supreme Leader Kaine has not authorized the nuclear weapons program he suspended in 2003. End of quote from Tulsi Gabbard. Trump dismissed that finding, saying, quote, well then, my intelligence community is wrong, end of quote. Really? On what basis does he think that the entire United States intelligence community is wrong? Third, diplomacy offers a better path to durably address Iran's nuclear activities than a military attack. This was proven in 2015 when the United States and world powers made an agreement that strictly limited Iran's nuclear activities and put in place blanket inspections. That agreement was working, but Trump pulled out of that deal in 2018 and Iran restarted its activities. To his credit, Trump returned to diplomacy this year, and U.S. officials held 5 rounds of talks with Iran to address this issue. A 6th round of talks was scheduled for June 15th, but Israel derailed those talks with its surprise attack and, in the process, assassinated the Iranian official overseeing those negotiations. Fourth, Benjamin Netanyahu should not be dictating U.S. foreign and military policy. Trump's attack on Iran would not have occurred if Israel had not launched an illegal, unprovoked surprise attack on Iran on June 13th, sabotaging U.S. diplomatic efforts. If the people of Israel support Netanyahu's decision to start a war with Iran, that is their business, that is their war. The United States should not be part of it. Fifth, the United States should not be allied with the Netanyahu government in any military effort. Netanyahu is a war criminal indicted by the International Criminal Court for starving and killing civilians in Gaza. His government is systematically destroying the Palestinian people, killing over 55,000 and wounding nearly 130,000, 2/3 of whom are women and children. Israel has destroyed the entire physical infrastructure of Gaza, housing, hospitals, schools, and water systems, and continues to prevent the delivery of humanitarian aid to starving civilians in violation of U.S. and international law. 6, this war is about more than Israel and Iran. It is about the very concept of international law and preventing a world where every dispute is settled with force. Whatever you think of the brutal, authoritarian, and terrorist-supporting Iranian regime, Netanyahu's surprise attack was a clear violation of international law and the UN Charter. The world appropriately condemned Russia for its unprovoked attack against Ukraine. The world appropriately condemned Hamas for their unprovoked terrorist attack against Israel. Israel should be condemned for its unprovoked attack against Iran, and the United States should not be part of that illegal action. Finally, Mr. President, wars are expensive. We need funding to address the health care crisis, the child care crisis, the education crisis, and many other crises our people face every day. We should be investing our resources in improving life for the American people, not wasting money on illegal and unnecessary wars. Last year alone, the U.S. provided $22 billion in military aid to Israel. Enough is enough. It is beyond absurd that we continue to finance Israel's wars while neglecting the needs of our own people. Mr. President, for all these reasons, I strongly support Senator Kaine's War Powers resolution to make clear that only Congress has the power to declare war, that there is no legal basis for war with Iran, and that the American people do not want more unnecessary, costly wars. Thank you.
Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you very much. This is a debate worthy of the body, and I would like to give my belief about what we're doing here, my opinion. Senator Kaine has introduced a resolution that basically require President Trump to come to the Congress before any other military actions could be taken against the Islamic Republic of Iran. I think that would be a disaster for the country. You can only have one commander-in-chief, not 535. Mr. President, you've been in it. You've been right close into the face of the enemy, and you probably above all others know what warfare is like dealing with radical Islam, and applaud your service as a Navy SEAL. So it says in the Constitution, the President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militias of the several states when called into actual service in the United States. Well, they left out the Air Force because back then we didn't have one. Since the founding of this country, it's been understood that the Commander-in-Chief can act as the Commander-in-Chief to protect our nation from threats, that he is in charge of the military. He sits atop of he's the civilian in charge of the military, and it's his decision to use military force. It's Congress's decision to declare war. How many times do you think, Mr. President, we've declared war since the founding of our nation? I'll give you the answer. 5. Just think about all the military conflicts that have existed in the history of our country, and we've only declared war 5 times. The War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, Spanish-American War against Spain, World War I and World War II. So to my colleagues, if Congress has only declared war 5 times, does that mean all of these other military operations are illegal? No. That's ridiculous. Because we have the power to declare war, and us, the Congress only, doesn't mean the Commander-in-Chief can't be the Commander-in-Chief. This country cannot be put in a legal state of war unless the Congress decides to do that. But to suggest that means the Commander-in-Chief can't do anything without our approval makes all of us Commander-in-Chiefs. Do you think they had that in mind? Do you think they really meant for the Congress to be the Commander-in-Chief, not the Commander-in-Chief? The logic of this is as follows. Because we have the ability to declare war, therefore, the President can't act unless we agree. You've taken his power to be Commander-in-Chief away. The War Powers Act of 1973, referenced by Senator Sanders, is not worth, in my view, the paper it's written on. It was an effort by the Congress back then to limit President Nixon's involvement in the Vietnam War. The way you do that constitutionally is that Congress has the power of the purse. If we don't like what a president is doing in terms of military engagement, we can stop the funding for that engagement. But just think the chaos that would ensue in this country, that if there were not one commander-in-chief, but 535, and we had to sit down and talk among ourselves and debate as to whether or not we should go forward with the military operation in question, that would paralyze this country. And this leak of the Defense Intelligence Assessment tells you exactly what would happen if they brought this problem over to us to solve. So it's been clear to me that only 5 times in the history of the country have we declared war, and we've had hundreds of military operations that the founders never envisioned. The ability to declare war means the President of the United States, as Commander-in-Chief, cannot act unless we agree, because that makes us the Commander-in-Chief, and that's not what they were trying to do. They were trying to make sure the country could not go into a legal situation involving war without the body as a whole making that decision. But when it comes to how to use the military and when to use the military, we have a single person who does that. That's the Commander-in-Chief, and that person can be limited by Congress's ability to cut off funding for military operations they don't approve of. So the War Powers Act, I think from its very founding, was unconstitutional. But this is a case study of the chaos that would be created if we accepted their version, the proponents' version of this. That President Trump would have to come to the Congress as a whole before he decided to strike the next nuclear facility that maybe we don't know about, or there's some imminent threat to our troops in the region. That's just not practical, and that's not what the founders meant. They put a single person in charge of the military, and that was the President of the United States. They made sure that going to war was a group decision. And in this country, we've used that process 5 times in 250 years. So not only did President Trump have the constitutional authority to engage in Operation Midnight Hammer, it was an incredible success. If you look up obliterate in the dictionary, it means to destroy utterly and wipe out. These 3 facilities were destroyed utterly and they were wiped out. They were obliterated. Now that doesn't mean that the threat from Iran is over. The desire of the regime still exists, and we'll have to deal with Iran down the road. But this vote, I think we all need to vote no, because what we're doing here, if we don't watch it, is having 535 commanders in chief that would paralyze this country. But something maybe we can agree on very quickly. Since the attack, the Iranian regime has gone on a terror campaign against their own people. They've arrested at least 700 people for ties to Israel. There have dozens of people been hanged, with basically drug out of their houses and hanged. Iran turns to internal crackdown in wake of 12-day war. I will be doing a resolution condemning this regime's action. What they're doing is that they're trying to maintain power over their people after this attack. People in Iran are getting fed up with the Ayatollah. Instead of listening to the people and changing the behavior of the regime is engaged in a terror campaign of extrajudicial killings, imprisonment, and beatings to suppress the people. And I think this body and the civilized world should condemn what's going on in Iran right now. As to negotiations to solve the Iranian nuclear ambitions and to try to get a deal with Iran that we can all live with, count me in for that. But you got to remember, the people you're negotiating with, as you talk to them, are killing their own people to try to keep them in control. And I've got one idea. Before we negotiate with Iran, they need to say one thing. We don't like Israel, we don't agree with Israel, but we recognize the right of the state of Israel to exist. The policy of the Iranian regime is to destroy the state of Israel, purify Islam, and come after us, the infidels. Until they change that policy, nothing's really going to work. So what I want to hear before we sit down and talk to the Ayatollah and his henchmen is that for the first time ever since the founding of the Iranian regime, they recognize Israel's right to exist. Is that too much to ask? Finally, this is the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. 80 years ago, this past month, the Nazis surrendered, and one of the hallmarks of the Nazi regime was to kill all the Jews. 80 years later, we're having a debate about a regime that wants a nuclear weapon to kill all the Jews, and we're wondering what to do. You know what we should do? We should make sure they can't kill all the Jews. We could make sure that this homicidal maniac, the Ayatollah, who's a religious Nazi, is not allowed to get a nuclear weapon and rain havoc on the region and come after us. It's hard to believe that 80 years later we would be having this debate. What should we do? To my good friend Senator Sanders, your solution will lead to World War III. You will appease evil. And World War II happened because people like Senator Sanders did not stand up to Hitler. They did not choose wisely. They did not stop him when they could. And that's exactly what's going on now. Until this religious Nazi regime gives up their desire to destroy the state of Israel, to wreak havoc on the region, and to come after us, chanting death to America, then we should stand up to them. I'm not advocating invading Iran, but I am advocating being tough, no sanctions relief, and don't reward this behavior. Vote no to Senator Kaine's proposal. Stand up for the Constitution as it's been implemented for over 250 years. And all of us pray for the Iranian people and for our friends in Israel that better days are ahead. But these better days only come with sacrifice. And as I speak, people in Iran are sacrificing because they just want to live free. I yield.
Tony, is it my up? Mr. President.
Senator from Idaho.
Mr. President, I rise today to oppose this unhelpful resolution. It's a clear attempt to take a slap at President Trump and nothing more. President Trump's foreign policy successes have been several and should be celebrated, not denigrated. For instance, recently his work when India and Pakistan started fighting, he got involved and he had that shut down pretty quickly. This morning, I had the good fortune to attend with Secretary Rubio an event at the State Department where a peace agreement was signed between Rwanda and the Congo. Both Rwanda and the Congo were effusive in their compliments of President Trump for negotiating the peace that happened. So the president's been hard at work trying to be the president of peace that he really wants to be. First, I think that we ought to have a good statement from the administration as to why this resolution is not well taken. And I'm going to quote from the Executive Office of the President, their statement on the policy. Senate Joint Resolution 59 fails to account for the dynamic security threat posed by Iran and its proxies, and our commitments to force protection in the region. On June 12th, the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors found that Iran had failed to comply with its nuclear safeguards obligations. Iran immediately responded, stating that it would establish a new uranium enrichment facility in a secure location and that other measures were being planned. Israel took action against Iran, an action it believed was necessary for its self-defense. The United States' top priority is protecting American forces in the region. President Trump will take all necessary steps to protect our forces, de-escalate conflict, and remain in close contact with our regional partners. Senate Joint Resolution 59 should be rejected also because it purports to limit the president's Article II authority under the Constitution and could hinder the president's ability in his constitutional role as commander-in-chief to protect the United States from the continued threat posed by Iran and its proxies. Senate Joint Resolution 59 also could hinder the president's ability to protect the United States forces in the region through actions to de-escalate the threat posed by Iran and its proxies. The operative part of this resolution that's before us states, quote, Congress hereby directs the president to terminate the use of United States armed forces from hostilities against the Islamic Republic of Iran. This might be appropriate if we were at war against Iran, or indeed if there were hostilities against Iran, but we are not, and we do not intend to. You can't terminate something that's not going on. Every American is opposed to the long, drawn-out conflicts that we have in our history from time to time experienced. I assure you that President Trump feels exactly the same way. He hates those long, drawn-out conflicts. He hates any kind of kinetic action, but realizes that as commander-in-chief, he has to take them at times. The president did take a single strike against Iran at carefully calculated targets and in an even more carefully calculated time, much like what he did with General Soleimani in his first term that was so successful. The strike on Iran was a single brief strike at 3 nuclear bomb facilities that ended the conflict between Israel and Iran. It was on behalf of a close ally, Israel, and on behalf of the world, which is unanimously against Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon. Most importantly, it ended a war. It did not start a war. If the U.S. or Donald Trump or any other president sought to declare war on Iran, this would be well taken. The Constitution is clear that only this body, the Congress of the United States, can declare war. But the Constitution and statutes are equally clear that the president not only may, but must act to defend America and Americans at a time or place that a threat presents itself. Congress has also spoken on the power of the president in the War Powers Act. Now, we've heard a lot on the floor today about how important the Founding Fathers thought declaration of war was. They were absolutely right. It is just as right today as it was then. There's a lot of difference between then and now. Then, we had oceans protecting us on each side, and for a war to take place, it took months to unfold and to start. In today's world, it's a press of a button, and it happens instantaneously. That's why Congress went in and passed the War Powers Act that gave the president the opportunity to defend America. And in that act, it provided things that the president had to do. He complied with that act exactly as it was put in place by Congress when he took the Single Strike Act against Iran. Also, the Justice Department has opined to Republican and Democrats presidents and created a precedent as to when the president could use power. This strike is in full compliance with that guidance. The guidance is very simple. Number one, if the president is going to take action, it must, one, be in a national interest, and number two, be limited in nature, scope, and duration. And of course, that's further modified by the action that Congress has taken in the War Powers Act. What this president did with this single strike was in full compliance with the Constitution and statutes. Both open source reporting and the classified briefing we received demonstrated this was a brilliant tactical move, which was brilliantly planned and executed after in-depth conversations with the intelligence community and the talented array of presidential advisors that President Trump has. My colleague on the other side of the aisle should do what we on our side of the aisle have been doing, and that is congratulate the president and the brave men and women who conceived and executed this spectacularly successful event and thank them, and recognize that this ended the conflict between Israel and Iran. Instead, what we have seen is an attempt in every way to denigrate the action, downplay it, and berate this great and glorious victory. This resolution that we have before us today is another sad attempt in that regard. I understand that the hate and vitriol against our president precipitates this kind of thinking. It's wrong. This is ill-conceived and will telegraph that we Americans do not stand with our president or with Israel. That is also wrong. Make no mistake, Iran is all alone in this. No one is coming to help them. This body, above all, should not be the entity that provides aid and comfort to Iran. I urge a no vote. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Virginia.
The remaining two speakers, Senator Schumer has yielded his time to me. I will be the last speaker before the vote. My colleague from Idaho says this is driven by hate and vitriol. Tell President Trump he well knows that from my first months in the Senate, I have taken this position now against four presidents, Democratic and Republican. The principles that have been stated on this floor about the Constitution and War Powers Resolution are very, very clear. Congress declares war. Once declared, the president is the commander-in-chief. There is no war without a declaration of Congress. The president as commander-in-chief can defend the United States against imminent attack, but there was no such imminent threat posed by the Iranian nuclear program, as the president's own national security advisor testified to Congress shortly before this strike, and as the Israeli foreign minister announced before the U.S. strike that the Israeli actions had set the nuclear program back 2 or 3 years. No imminent attack on the United States, no imminent threat. That means Congress gets to declare war. This is not about hatred for any president. It is about standing up and doing what we took an oath to do. My colleague from South Carolina says we've only declared war 5 times, ending with World War II. That's not accurate. Congress has had the guts to at least vote on authorizing war up through 2002. But in 2002, something happened, Mr. President, in this body. The Senate and the House got lied into a war with bogus intelligence about the weapons program of the nation of Iraq. We should be haunted by that. We should be haunted by that. The claims that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction led us into a war where thousands of troops and thousands of U.S. contractors were killed. And so what should have been the learning that came out of that we should do a good job kicking the tires as Congress before we go into a war and not get lied into a war. Instead, Mr. President, what I fear, since there's been no willingness of Congress to vote on any war since 2002, is what members of this body have decided is, wow, we got it wrong. We were lied into a war. We voted in a way that we regretted. So let's not vote at all. Let's not vote at all. Let's overturn the congressional and constitutional history that says we only go to war with Congress and try to hide in the grass. Many of my colleagues have said things about Iran and how bad Iran is. None of them have ever introduced an authorization for war against Iran. If Iran is so bad, do that. People in this body would rather not vote so they can't be held accountable. I get that. That's a human impulse. It's just a human impulse that so disrespects the service of our men and women in uniform. If we're going to send troops into harm's way, our sons and daughters, whether they're flying bombing missions or ground troops or covert operations, we ought to have the guts in this body to cast a vote saying that that war is necessary. Not just act as cheerleaders and hide from culpability, hide from accountability, hide from responsibility. If you vote against Senate Joint Resolution 59, what you are saying is this president should be able to wage war without coming to Congress. If you think the president should have to come to Congress, whether you're for or against a war in Iran, you'll support Senate Joint Resolution 59. You'll support the Constitution that has stood the test of time. You'll support your oath. I urge a positive vote on the resolution, and I yield back.
Question occurs on the motion to discharge SJ Res 59.
I'd ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso.
No.
Smith. Thanks. Thank you. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt-Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kaine, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim,
We'll take it.
Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey,
No.
Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Marino, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla,
From Vermont.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you for tuning into the live show. Yes, we just witnessed the Congress saying that, you know what? Well, the liberal part of Congress saying that, you know what? Maybe we don't want to give the president the ability to do what he did in Iran, which secured peace. Okay? That's what nobody's talking about. What he did with the Iranian nuclear sites secured and guaranteed peace. And that's why there is a ceasefire in the Middle East right now between Israel and Iran. But nobody's talking about the ceasefire. Everybody's just talking about, oh, well, look what he did to Iran. Like, if you are American, why aren't you supporting your beloved country? Anyway, I am going to be forever grateful to the United States. Shout out to the United States. Shout out to the American people. Shout out to the legal immigrant. God bless y'all. Instead of looking for perfection, seek for consistency. Never give up on yourself. Never give up on your dreams. Never give up on God. Believe in yourself. Believe in your dreams. And believe in Almighty God. God is the greatest. America is the greatest nation on the face of the earth. Fathers, take care of your kids. I just got back from the tennis club with my beautiful daughter, and she's doing great. She's learned the volley, she's learned the forehand, and she's learned our ready position. So, look, it's been fun. I'm glad, and I'm grateful to you guys for being here. God is the greatest. Also, shout out to the law enforcement officers. Shout out to the military and the veterans. God bless you. Thank you for all that you've done for the United States. Thank you for securing the United States and the homeland. Shout out to Ice Ice Baby. Ice Ice Baby. Ice Ice Baby. Shout out to Ice. All right, with that being said, you guys are awesome. And shout out to the fathers one more time. Take care of your kids. Spend time with your kids. I know you work hard. But spend some time with your kids. And mothers, God bless you. God bless you also. No matter what you're going through in life, God got you. No matter what you're going through, just know God is your strength and is going to be with you every step of the way. And it is your boy Genesis. Welcome to the Genesis Show. It is currently 6:12 p.m. in Georgia. And today's date is the 29th of June 2025. All right, see y'all soon. Love y'all.